being here today, and a special welcome to our guests. We hate that you're dealing with the annoyance of power issues, but we are thrilled that you're here with us. That's making the best out of a bad situation. God's people coming together, it's a wonderful thing, and we hope you feel loved and welcome here. As has been mentioned, we'll be studying today about the qualifications of elders and deacons. This is part of an ongoing work that honestly never really stops in the Lord's church, but it's particularly being emphasized right now as Brother JR and I are planning to make the rounds and visit with you. That's going to take us a while. We both have travel, we both have other obligations, but as much as we can align our schedules, we'll be getting together and reaching out to you. And this morning's study will form the framework of the discussions we want to have with you about who you feel like may be potentially qualified right away or at some point down the road, who you see as potential for the future. Our elders in the past have used this kind of information to guide them in their efforts to be a part of this work to add officers, and we have used this data in what we recommend, and so it's an important work, and we want you to understand, we want to hear from you about the qualifications. This isn't about who you like or don't like. I know there's people that our personalities don't blend with. And that's really a challenge, and the Lord teaches us things that help us work through that. But we don't need to hear from you about who got on your nerves or whatever like that. And we're not going to tell you who gets on our nerves. We don't want you to know, okay? We want to know what you believe or who you believe matches the qualifications that we read about in Scripture, because that's what the Lord has decreed this discussion should be about. And that's what we will restrict this discussion to. 1 Timothy 3, the first 7 verses, speaks to us about elders. It was already read in your hearing. This is the King James Version, and I've left those passages here in our slides because that's what the wording of the outline is based off of, but there's similar words used in newer English translations. We'll try to keep that all together as we proceed through our study. It's a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and a snare of the devil. Now, we read the qualifications from Paul's letter to Titus in Titus chapter 1. We begin at verse 6. If, talking about who to appoint as an elder, if any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. For a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate, holding fast the faithful word as he's been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. Now, the qualifications for deacons in 1 Timothy 3, verse 8 through 12. Likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre, holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. Let these also first be proved, then let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless. Even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. Let the deacons be the husband of one wife, ruling their children in their own houses well. So these are the readings from the New Testament that give us the criteria one must meet. And for simplicity of outlining our study, in an effort to kind of avoid needless repetition, I've broken these into 3 different categories and lumped together the qualifications for deacons and elders. They are very similar And in the areas where the qualifications are slightly different, we will note those in the course of our discussion. There are some qualities that relate to the man's family life. There are some qualities that relate to his moral integrity. There are qualities that relate to his work skills. There is admitted overlap between these. For example, how well he handles his family is stated as a work skill. How well he can lead the church is reflected by how well he can lead the family. Being a lover of good men, one of these moral integrity issues in that middle column there, that is going to affect his ability to work, okay? That is a work skill in a manner of speaking. So I'm not trying to present this as an absolute ironclad division. It's just a general way to categorize these for the sake of our study today. So let's talk about his family qualities. Number one, husband of one wife. Right out of the gate. I'm not going to waste any time about this. We're going to get to a qualification about which there has been a great deal of question and controversy. And I'm going to teach what I have come to believe is the truth. And you may not agree with that, and that is perfectly fine. I have believed different things about different ones of these qualifications through the years, and I have been wrong through the years. And so, how would it be fair on my part to be displeased if you've honestly reached a conclusion that I once held? I can't fault you for that. I just ask you to give your honest attention to what the Scriptures say. This afternoon in our study, we're going to talk specifically about the Apostle Peter because he was an elder, and we're going to look at him and look at the question of was he qualified. In our pursuit of that study, it's going to help explain some things that relate to difficult questions on these qualifications, things that we wrestle with. So it's understood there's going to be questions about this, and you may see some of this differently, so let's just hang on. A bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, and the same is said of the deacon, that let the deacons be the husbands of one wife. What is this saying? Someone says, well, that means that he can only have had one wife across his lifetime. He's never been married before, other than the one that he's married to now. Reread it. It's not what it says. I know it's been a cherished view in the church for years, and it's wrong. That is not what that text says. Husband of one wife. This is not counting lifetime spouses. This is a character quality that speaks to who and what he is as a man. One time I was visiting with an elder about this, and he said, well, if you'll just read it for what it says he could only have had one wife for the whole span of his lifetime. And I said, no, it doesn't say that. If we just read it for what it said, it's my understanding that the most hyper-literal translation of this would be one-woman man. It's not counting his lifetime spouses. It's asking what kind of man is he? Is he a one-woman man? Now, let's put this in simple terms that will make sense. Because in your mind right now, you might be wrestling with this, saying, I don't know, Dave. That sounds new and different to me. We have long believed this in the church. Sometimes we just didn't realize it. If a man's wife dies and he marries again, is he no longer a husband of one wife? Well, he's not a husband of two. That's pretty simple, isn't it? You know, we've had this in the church for decades. We've had brethren that served well and served honorably, even right here. Somebody who has lost a wife and then they later remarried, and you know what? There's still this quality, this caliber of a man. Now, let's turn that around the other way. Have you ever known somebody that was married to the same woman for 50 years, but he was not content to keep his affections at home? You may look at his life and count lifetime spouses and say, well, he's only had one, so the other way of understanding husband of one wife, we would say he checks that box. But he's not a one-woman man because he's not content to be with just one woman. And he's demonstrated that by some varying degree of unfaithfulness, and that can be a problem, can't it? This is about his moral character and quality. Is he a man that is a one-woman man? Has he shown that level of devotion and faithfulness to his wife? But that's a hard pill to swallow if you always held the traditional view that this is counting lifetime spouses. I want you to know there's nothing in the grammatical sense of the text that looks in the past. This is a present look at his character. Okay, so I don't have this on the screen, but think of 1 Timothy 5, where we have the criteria that a woman must meet as a widow to be a widow indeed who would receive apparently regular care from the church. And one of those qualities is she's got to be a one-man woman, a wife of one husband. Okay? So it's the same thing that's said of elders and deacons here. It's just gender flipped. So let's play with that a little bit. Let's suppose you have two sisters in the church that are now widows, and in every way, they meet all the criteria to be under the church's routine care as a widow. One of them, she got married when she was young, and she stayed married, and then he died, and there wasn't a circumstance that allowed for kids to care for her, so the church is taking her on to help her because she's a widow indeed. Right? We're on board. And then here comes the other. And I'm building this scenario not off of wild hypotheticals, but off of real life stories. She got married when she was young. She was true and loyal to her husband. And he was a construction worker, and he died a construction accident. And she was young. And she did what 1 Timothy 5 commands her to do. She remarried to have a family, because that's what 1 Timothy 5 says to do. Younger widows, I want you to marry. Okay, so that's what she did. She obeyed that passage. And then, 40 years later, she's up for consideration. Is she a widow indeed? Well, she's had two husbands. So we're going to penalize her for obeying what Paul told her to do? And say, counting lifetime spouses, she's had two, so sorry, you're going to have to starve to death. Now that may sound ridiculous to you, but the phrasing is the same in both the scenarios. It's just gender flipped. And when we're talking in that scenario about this widow, we can see it's a positive mark to her character that she took to heart the Lord's counsel that, you know what, she can remarry and have a family. And so she did that. And we're not going to penalize her for doing that. We'll respect her. Why would it be different for a man? We want to know, is this man of a heart to be true to his wife? Is he a one-woman man? Rules well his own house. 1 Timothy 3 rules well his own house, having his children in subjection. And he goes on to say, if a man doesn't know how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? So, what is this teaching? Well, this is something I'll spend a little time on, Lord willing, this afternoon. So if you want more on this, I invite you to be with us for this afternoon study. Titus 1 says, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. Historically, I've read this word faithful as meaning having Christian children. And that word that's translated faithful is used quite a bit in the New Testament. And it can mean faithful in the sense of this person is a believer, they're faithful to God. And it can also mean faithful to authority. So there's nothing in the meaning of that word that says, well, all his kids had to have been baptized. That's how we sometimes take that. And I'm not saying that condition is irrelevant. I'm just saying let's back up and take it for what it says. And what it says is he's got to have faithful children. Well, I want to know what the Lord means by faithful, because sometimes the word that means they're Christians, and sometimes it means they're faithful to his leadership or faithful to some authority. What does it mean here? How about let's relax and let the Holy Spirit define the word for us. Having faithful children. What do you mean? Not accused of riot or unruly. That sounds like the Lord just defined for us what he means by faithful. What's the whole point? Well, when we look in 1 Timothy 3, the whole point is to see how well can this man lead his family. And I get it, whether or not all of his kids have obeyed the gospel and are faithful to the church, I get it, that's something you would look at. But this passage doesn't say all his kids got to be Christians. Okay, let's read it for what it says. So when we ask you about potential candidates, we're asking you because the Lord is asking us, who do you see doing a good job leading their family and having their children in subjection? Faithful children. Children in subjection, faithful to their father's rule, not accused of riot or unruly. Well, children is plural, so that means he's got to have more than one kid, right? No. The word that's translated children there means offspring. It doesn't mean plural as opposed to singular. Well, children means more than one, so okay, children obey your parents. An only child doesn't have to do what mom and dad say. How far are we going to ride that horse? Let's think about these things. That word means offspring. Whatever offspring he has, are they faithful to his rule? The Lord's point is for us to look at this person and ask the question, is this person a good and effective leader? Well, what about once his kids are grown? Man, that's an outstanding question. I've wrestled with that a lot. And I can assure you, JR has wrestled with this a lot as we've thought either together in a work or in works where we were somewhere else working with someone else. And I'm sure our shepherds have thought a lot about this. What about once a guy's kids are grown? If you'll notice carefully, the language is very emphatic and deliberate that his rulership is over his own house. Tanya and I have 2 kids. They're grown and married. They've moved out. I have no authority over David and Lisa's house. None. I have no authority over Leon and Ellen's house in Shawnee. None. They are not under my rule. What they do is not my responsibility. My responsibility passed long ago to be partners with Tanya in raising those children to do and be what they're supposed to do and be. His own house is what he's expected to rule well. If he can't rule his own house, how can he rule the church of God? Let's make this as kind of apples to apples as we can. Our elders here, are they responsible for what? We've got Norman visitors. Are they responsible for what the Norman congregation does? Do they bear that duty? And if Norman does something that you would question, is that our elders? Do they have to go fix that? Well, no. When we read about their authority in 1 Peter chapter 5, we read that their responsibility is the flock that they are a part of. That sounds kind of emphatic like this language here. Their authority doesn't reach outside the flock. In like manner, a father's authority doesn't reach outside his home. So we're asking, how good of a dad has he been when the children were under his care? Timothy's words about the deacon ruling their children and their own houses well. He doesn't stipulate that they have to be Christians in any kind of language. He's just got to be good at being a dad. So you might have a candidate that have kids that are arguably not old enough to understand the gospel and obey the gospel. I'm not saying we got to rush and make those guys deacons. I'm saying when you look at that, that leaves room for that question to be asked. So you're going to look at this guy. He's a young father, and you're going to try to make a discernment. Is he ruling his children well? And with the language in these qualifications, the difference we see with the elders is there's more said about them not being accused of riot or unruly. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about moral integrity. He's got to be blameless. Philippians 2 asks all Christians to be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. We're looking for someone that's above reproach. Language that I've heard JR use often in our work together is if you heard something really, really terrible about that person, you'd really struggle to believe it. They're that kind of character. They're high moral character. They are above reproach. They are blameless. Sober. You'll see the word grave used sometimes. Newer translations use different words. This word that's used can mean sober in the sense of not drunk or not intoxicated, but it can mean, just like we use the English word sober, sometimes it doesn't mean not intoxicated. Sometimes it just has to do with a sober frame of mind. And certainly the people that are serving as officers in the church need to not be intoxicated, and they need to have this sober frame of mind, of good behavior. That doesn't sound like someone that's perfect. That sounds like someone that's known as conducting themselves well. Not given to wine. They're not enslaved to the use of alcohol. No striker. That has to do with physical violence. And I think the translation that was on the screen when Brother Larry read for us used that language. Not guilty of physical violence. Not greedy. Greedy of ill-gotten gain. A man whose ambitions are attached to this world is going to have a hard time leading the church to be different from the world, isn't he? Patient. Great day in the morning do you need to be patient to be able to be an elder. Look, shepherding fatigue is a real issue. Guys get weary with their work. They lean on each other. They bring to bear others within their reach, perhaps from the flock or perhaps an evangelist or whatever, to try to, get help in dealing with things, because they get fatigue of just dealing with the crisis after crisis. And so to be able to bear those kinds of times, you've got to have uncommon patience to be able to do that. Just, that's somebody who's right or fair-minded. Continuing with moral integrity. Holy, that's set apart from the world. Temperate, that's self-control. They've got to be able to exercise self-control in their day-to-day ethics and not let their conduct get off out into left field. They've got to exercise self-control with you and with me as they deal with their frustrations of leading us, don't they? They have to have self-control with one another, because they sit around the table to discuss decisions, and newsflash, they do not always agree with one another. And in keeping with their duty, they're obligated to voice their convictions with great clarity, and that makes for difficult discussions. And they've got to be able to have self-control in those difficult discussions to not fly off at the handle. It's important, isn't it? Not soon angry, kind of tied to this idea. Being able to contain their temper, having a good report, that's a good reputation in and out of the church. A lover of good men. You cannot effectively shepherd if you don't just, at the end of the day, deeply care. And as sheep of the flock, we need to know that our shepherds really care about our problems we're facing. And if they don't love good people, they're not going to care like they should. I remember several years ago, in fact, it was here, I was talking to Mike, and he was talking about different tasks that the eldership at that time would assign people. And he talked about this concept of trying to instill in young Christians this idea of caring about everybody in the flock from top to bottom. I don't know if he remembers that discussion. That really stuck with me, to have the wisdom of having intentionality in the tasks they assign and the things they ask the brothers to do, and then watching that unfold. Whatever words they would use to describe their intent, at the end of the day, they're basically looking to see, is this a person that is a lover of good men? Is this someone that displays that they care? Not double-tongued, talking out of both sides of your mouth. Boy, that's a problem. You want to please the people that are standing closest to you in the conversation that's at hand, but then if it takes something different to please another group of people you're talking to at a different time about some problem we're all working through, before long you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, and that's not going to work. Let's talk about the work skills. They've got to be vigilant, watchful. We understand the role of shepherds to protect the sheep from the wolf. That's talked about a lot in Scripture, Old and New Testament. It's talked about in their qualifications and the capabilities they're possessed to teach the Word, which we'll deal with in a moment. They've got to be watchful for someone that needs spiritual attention and correction. It may not necessarily be a wolf. It may not be a false teacher that's a threat to the flock. It may be somebody in the flock that's worked through a lesson and they're teaching, or they hold some idea or something like that, that they need help understanding that. And so these guys got to have everybody on their radar. On vigilant, think vigil. They're constantly holding vigil, watching for things that need attention. They're not just watching for potential threats or problems or someone that's, holding to an idea that threatens the spiritual integrity of their fellow Christians. They're watching for the wounded sheep. They're watching for who's crying alone in the dark and who needs help and who needs love and who needs to just feel like, hey, they care and they're here. And you cannot do that if you're not watchful. Isaiah 55 talks about this as it specifically relates to threats of the flock. In Isaiah 56, 10, and 11, his watchmen are blind, they're all ignorant, they're all dumb dogs, they cannot bark, sleeping, lying down, loving to slumber. Yea, they are greedy dogs which can never have enough, and they are shepherds that cannot understand. They all look to their own way, everyone for his own gain from his quarter. Wow, that's unflattering. That just overwhelms me every time I read that, how unflattering that is. And when I read this about the failed shepherds of Israel, here's the mental picture I get. Going up on someone's porch out in the middle of nowhere to make a visit, and there's the hound dog under the porch. And it's all he can do to muster the energy and the courage to raise one eyelid and cock his head and see that you're coming, and then it just falls like a brick, and he's back asleep. That's the muted dog that can't bark. He's got a lazy streak. You want to see that dog move? Rattle a food bowl. Then he's lightning with grease on it, He'll really move then. That's looking out for his own quarter, looking out for his own gain. That's the picture this paints. I think this was probably written before hound dogs were ever, developed as a breed. But it's the idea of just a lazy dog that won't get up and move until it's time to eat. That's what it's like when the watchmen are blind to the threats or the needs of the flock. That's why that's such an important qualification. Given to hospitality. This is said in both qualification lists, and wow, how transforming can hospitality work be? Our elders have been and remain good to have people in their home. And that's really important. I just want to tell you from an observation standpoint, through the years working in the church, going into places and working, bringing in new people, coming back months or a couple of years later and seeing the progress and who stays and who doesn't. Christians getting in one another's homes is such an immeasurable game changer. It is a game changer. When we are in each other's homes and in each other's lives, that increases the chances of us hanging in there so much more. Listen, please listen. We have to work together to make the church hard to leave, because the devil always is after us to leave the flock. We have to work to make it hard for a person to do that. And there's a lot of different ways that happens, but one of those ways is just persistent, loving hospitality. And through the years and the ebb and flow of mine and Tanya's work in the ministry that I have, and that J.R. and Elizabeth, I'm sure, would report the same, the times of using our home as a tool in that work, which that ties you to your local work, so I can't do that on the road, but the times that we use our home, it's always so much more impactful and lasting, just in terms of the odds and the statistics. Who stays, who goes, who hangs in there, who grows, who sticks around. You can trace it right back to being able to be in one another's homes. And who leads us in that? It's our elders. And this is a lot of work on their wives. Recognize that. A lot of times it's the unseen warriors that are really winning the battle. And these guys are doing great work when they have people in their home to just encourage them, or to have a Bible study, if it's a formal study or just an informal discussion. And everyone will tell you they're riding their wife's coattail because of that hospitality. Able to teach. 1 Timothy says, able to teach. Titus expands that, holding fast the faithful word, as he's been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convince the gainsayers. He's got to be able to face the opposition. He's got to be able to face the naysayer. It's not enough to just be a marginal teacher. He has to be able to teach well enough to be effective, to communicate, the truth against error. No preacher, no elder, nobody in this world knows every answer to every point that false teachers make. Nobody knows everything, all right? Let's understand what this qualification is teaching. It's teaching that the man has to be well trained enough, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught. He's got to be well trained enough to pose opposition to threats to the body. So that's more than just he can kind of stitch together a lesson. That's a man who is an effective communicator, an effective teacher. And if you tie this back to the family character quality, it starts to make more sense. He's been able to effectively communicate to his children while they were under his rulership. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that he can effectively communicate the word to the flock. With deacons, it's not required that he be able to teach, but it is said he's got to hold the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. So you may have guys that serve as deacons who aren't effective, capable communicators in the sense of teaching, like we think of teaching, public or private, but he knows the word. And there are a lot of men I've been blessed to know through the years who've served as fantastic deacons who they just weren't capable teachers. That wasn't who they were. That wasn't where their talents were. Some guys aren't wired with, the nerve, so to speak, to face a crowd and be in front of a group. It's what might be normal to brethren, to some of you guys, to stand up and teach. To them, that's just a mountain they can't climb. Some can kind of overcome that fear and stage fright, and they have hidden abilities that they eventually come to discover through work and training and effort, and others, that's just not who they are. So there's room in the church for officers and workers that don't necessarily teach publicly, and that fits what we're saying about the deacons and what the qualities are. Another work skill is he's not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into condemnation of the devil. So you don't want him to be newly planted. That's what the word novice there means. So that his pride doesn't get the best of him, just like that's what was the snare of the devil. That's what trapped Satan, was his pride. And that's what this passage is telling you. And so the warning is, if it could trap, this great angel that God created, it can trap any one of us. And I think Mike and I have talked about this off and on quite a bit over the last several weeks and months. And, we're on the same page here. And the more I work, the more I'm convinced this is true. Sisters, this may fit you. Take this to heart, but I want to talk to the brethren, especially if you have talents that lend themselves to being in the public eye. Start every day with the assumption that you have a pride problem. Start that day assuming I've got a pride problem and I'm too proud to see it. Well, but I don't think he's that. I think he's humble. That's great that you think that about your husband or your son or your brother or whatever, and I'm not trying to convince you otherwise. I'm trying to convince him to start every day assuming he has a problem he's too proud to see. If you'll do that and work intentionally on humility accordingly, it will help a great deal. Not self-willed. This goes back to those discussions that shepherds have to have about what to do and which way to lead the flock, and are we going to zig or are we going to zag? And it is amazing and a blessing that they don't all agree. We need that. We need voices calling each other into question and holding each other accountable and making that other person thoroughly establish their point of view, to hold it to the scrutiny, to make sure that this is the best idea, okay? We need that, but they can't approach that from the standpoint of my way or the highway. That won't work. There's got to be an ability and a willingness to yield and give ground where conscience will allow, where right and wrong will allow, and in areas of judgment, have some ebb and flow and give and take. Well, that's such a hard list, I just don't think anybody will ever qualify. If you're thinking that, I've heard that for years. Come this afternoon, we're going to talk about that. This is not a list of impossible qualities that is there to make sure we never have church officers. This is a list to use as a criteria. JR and I are called upon as evangelists to make a choice of who we recommend for appointment, and we are bound to these lists that we've read and studied very briefly this morning. And we're committed to sticking with this list. These are qualities that God is asking you to look at because some of these relate to the flock's perception of their potential officers. And we want to hear from you about that. And brothers, young families, these are qualities you can look at and work on. And it may be that where your talents are and your life circumstances are that, being an elder or a deacon someday is not where you fit. And that's perfectly fine. We need everybody in every kind of role. And 1 Corinthians 12 talks to us about the importance of everybody in the body having their place and being important before God. But if your circumstances and your abilities allow for the possibility of you serving as an officer someday, we've just talked about a list of character qualities you can intentionally work on and develop because the church needs good officers. There's always more work to do. As we close this study, I hope you can see an underlying theme and current of thought of what is the will of God. These things are God's will as it relates to how His family is handled and the way that we walk and live and function as a collective body of Christ. And we're interested in God's will for that, which is rooted in God's will for you as an individual. And the first thing for you to do as an individual to match God's will for your life is become a Christian. And that is eternally important. So that's why we give an opportunity now at this time in the services for you to do that, if that is your interest. If you're not a Christian and you want to become a Christian, we would love to help you. If you are a Christian and you need the church to pray for you, we invite you to come, have a seat on the front while we stand and while we sing.